I think it was
Before Scapus.
She wanted to.
That's the one paper. Yeah.
All right. Why don't we go ahead and call the work session to order? And I will just hand it over to the chief of police.
All right. Good evening, Mayor, councilors. Tonight, we're doing a presentation with City County Insurance Services. CIS was contacted to do a couple of assessments of the police department earlier this year. And tonight, we're going to discuss those findings. On April 21st, earlier this year, Stuart Robertson conducted a best practices risk assessment management assessment. Sorry. And on April 29th, Kurt Chapman conducted a recruitment, selection, hiring, and initial training assessment. Both Stuart and Kurt are here tonight to discuss their findings with you and answer any questions you may have. Start with Stuart Robertson.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Mayor, members of council, Stuart Robertson with CIS. I am currently the patrol law enforcement risk management consultant. A little bit about me. I spent 29 years in Oregon law enforcement, the last 18 as the chief of police in Pendleton. I've been with CIS since December of this last year. I had a stint as the president of the Oregon Chiefs Association, was a former member of the board, DPSST board, Department of Public Safety Standards and Training, Oregon Accreditation Alliance Board, a number of other functions throughout the state specific to Oregon law enforcement. In April of this year, I conducted an on-site review of the Scapus Police Department. Present during that meeting, conversation / review were both former Chief Miller and Lieutenant Rouches. I posed 237 questions, which are utilized as baseline criteria for the review. They're based on statute, rule, and case law. The review makes no attempt to evaluate the culture or the personnel within the organization. It's really a review that looks at industry standards and best practices in terms of policy and whether the policies that are in place match the practices that are being deployed. So in many instances, I pose the question and listen to the response and note the information. And then when I go back and review the policy, I make that evaluation or determination based on the response versus what's actually written in the policy that I've requested. I also review emergency operations plans, continuity of operations plans, usually request copies of the most recent, and again, there's some random requests associated with this, use of force reports, as well as pursuit reviews and other documentation associated to personnel matters and such and like, so I can get a better picture of maybe the operation in and of itself. So in this particular instance, both chief and lieutenant were very responsive, very inviting, very cordial, and provided me with all the information that I needed. I put the report together, and then typically what I do is I'll send the report to the agency, and more specifically the people who are involved in the evaluation, allow them to make any recommendations, modifications, suggestions, otherwise, and then we have a meeting to discuss all of the recommendations that are within the report. Now, certainly in this particular report, not everything that we discussed is memorialized. I provided examples to the chief at his request based on the conversation we had during the onsite. One specifically was a matrix or codification for progressive discipline. One had to do with disposition of evidence and the signing off on evidence as it's either destroyed or transferred for city use. And there were some other documents associated with this particular review. The reality of consistent theme throughout would probably be a little bit of apathy in terms of documentation and or updating of information, but certainly nothing to the point and degree that would cause me any real grave concerns. I detailed some items to allow him the opportunity to work on them and allow me the opportunity to have some ongoing conversation, which is why I try to end all these reports on a positive note. The reality is the CIS has no regulatory authority over the agencies that we work with. So I have to be fairly tactful in how I approach these types of reviews. And I try to leave the door open on the back end so I can at least have further conversation, especially in agencies that need a lot more intervention. And so it's really kind of a delicate dance. And I've heard some characterizations of this report that it was glowing and such and alike, and certainly not my intent. I mean, again, there were no, what I would characterize as glaringly deficient performance issues, but there were certainly things that needed to be updated and addressed. And certainly conversations that I had with the chief, there were several after this particular report was provided to him and up until the point where he decided to step down. So what work was completed, I can't speak to that. I can just speak to the conversations that we had and the recommendations that I made.
Last name is Rock. Did you say Rock?
Roberts, Roberts.
So coming out of Pendleton, I assume you know Larry Lehman.
I do. I worked for Larry for several years.
Yeah, so he was an interim city manager here for a bit. One question that kind of popped out to me in your assessment, there was a kind of an interesting letter that was addressed to then city manager Sykes in March of 2020 that articulated from the then lieutenant that was in the department kind of a litany of problems, of kind of the cultural problems you're talking about. Did you see that as a part of your assessment?
So letter from whom?
It was the then Lieutenant James McFarlane.
No.
Oh, you didn't see that?
No.
Okay. All right, that was just my question.
Sure.
Just to clarify, at the beginning of your presentation, you said this was not about personnel, this was about operations, correct?
That's correct. I mean, we're not in the business of assessing cultures or competencies of personnel. Our charge is, and I have about 130 agencies. I'm the only one that does what I do with the organization. So, ideally, it would be great if we could have that luxury to be able to come into an organization and make that level of assessment. But we're really concerned about, lack of a better terminology, those issues that are most consistently litigated in terms of performance deficiencies related to law or rule of order.
I have a question. First of all, I thought the report was very, very good, interesting. Mentioned, sorry. Oh, about this. You mentioned a formal characteristic success criterion. Can you tell me what that is?
Pardon me, Mr. McHugh, I think that was in my report.
Oh, okay. Okay, what is that?
How do you want this to work? Do you want us?
Why don't we?
Just, we'll get to that later then. I'm sorry.
There's no other questions. We'll let Kurt Chapman talk about his report.
Okay.
Again, like Stuart Roberts, thank you all. Like Stuart Roberts, wow, you really do have to be close, don't you?
Yes.
So they hear you, yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting us here tonight, Mayor, Council, Alex, and staff. I have worked in the field of human resources, emergency response, and risk management for 44 years now. The first 32 years spent in the private sector, the last 12 years in the public sector. 5 years with the city of Bend as their assistant HR manager and then their risk manager. And then the past 7, almost, it'll be 8 years come June with CIS. I am the public safety senior human resources consultant. And in that role, very similar to what Stuart's role is, I work with leadership teams for police, fire, sheriffs, dispatch, corrections, everything under what you would consider the public safety umbrella. Like Stuart, I am a one-person band. Our law enforcement group consists of Stuart, myself, and a corrections risk management specialist. And so we're spread pretty thin across the state. I have worked with Scapus Police Department.
Scapus.
Scapus. God, I've done that before, and I do apologize. I
And it was
have-
probably me correcting you.
I have worked with Scapus, PD, off and on various issues that had to do with personnel for several years. The hiring and recruitment assessment and report that I did this last year, again, similar to what Stuart does, is I come in and based on best practice and knowledge of what both federal and Oregon law stipulate in the recruitment and hiring process, as well as best practices to get a successful candidate through your system, and who then is a successful officer. The name of our program is called Hire to Retire. And in the human resources area, we work closely with the member on a successful hire all the way through a successful when the person leaves the agency. That may be due to a lateral transfer to another agency. It may be due to other issues or hopefully retirement. But in the event that it's not a successful transition or a successful thing, we also help with that. Again, these questions that I have are based on what we have seen from litigation and what federal and state law say. In my review, I spoke with then Chief and Jill Hare to go over the process and everything else. Out of that review came 11 recommendations. And again, these are best practice recommendations. I don't make a characterization of the overall morale or the quality of the personnel within the department. So that was the genesis of the report. I do these across the state and kind of use it as a roadmap, in this case with Interim Chief Sean Davis. Actually be working with him on some of these things, specifically the panel interview questions or the entry level process that he's going to be conducting.
Kind of a generic question. Among you, you have roughly 100 years of experience, kind of related or direct with police, law enforcement. So just kind of for a context, you kind of sum up in, let's say, 3 characteristics, what creates a good, positive culture in a police department?
I think culture in any employer is defined by the actions and the processes that we do, and especially that our leaders do on a daily basis. It's, are we doing what needs to be done when nobody's looking? And so defining your culture, could be very, very different than a neighboring department right here in Columbia County. But culture is what we do day in and day out. And in this case, serving the citizens of Scapus, and how we do that within the course and scope of the mission, vision, and values established for the city and for the department.
But you wouldn't have any suggestions going forward as to how we can cultivate a really positive culture and to develop a real kind of esprit de corps and morale where that reduces turnover and everything just functions more easily.
Well, full disclosure, I was raised as the son of a Marine Corps officer. So if you want positive culture, you define what it is right up front you hold yourself accountable to it visibly for all the troops, and you hold all the troops accountable to it. And then you celebrate it every single day.
Communication is really the catalyst. I mean, you communicate expectations, you empower your people, and you support them. And that support is going to come through accountability, either through remediation or some more drastic measure, or it's just praise. Oftentimes, cultures go awry, especially the law enforcement culture, because there's so much skepticism and negativity associated with the work. And then the people inside become very pessimistic as well. And you just have this erosion that occurs. So, an engaged leader is very important if you're going to have a successful organization that has a culture that's positive.
I would also say that, especially in law enforcement, the last 8 or 9 years have been especially challenging in law enforcement in the United States of America. And it takes a strong leader to keep a bunker mentality from developing, a us versus them mentality. And it's hard for that leader or those leaders themselves to not see it creeping in to their psyche. So it's very, very difficult. As Stuart said, communication is key. Keeping yourself healthy is key. It's no secret that if you've seen any of my training materials, we have just gotten out of a 20-year war in the Middle East that was fought disproportionately by volunteers, by reservists and National Guard members. Reservists and National Guard members disproportionately come from public safety in the public sector. I personally have friends that have done 5 and 6 tours. So they come back from that, and and it's like you're in greens one day, or browns, or camo, and then the next day you're back in blue. And so it's been a very, very trying 8 years with everything going on, and it takes a strong, committed leader and leadership team. First, to define what the culture is going to be, and then to develop that culture and hold themselves and everyone accountable.
Thank you for that elaborate explanation.
So just getting back to the report at hand that you have in front of us here, going forward, obviously this was presented to a chief that's no longer here. So this question is for our interim and for our city manager. What are the next steps that council can see moving forward?
Yeah, so I've been working with Jill on the hiring process. We looked at how we were putting it out there, where we're putting the ads out there. We're also working with CIS to make sure our questions are all encompassing and they're up to date. Some of the questions that were asked previously are pretty old. So we always got to be learning. We always got to get better. So some of those questions are going to be asked in the new panel interviews. I'm also going to be bringing, it's not just me going to be doing a chief's interview, right? I'm going to have command staff in there with me so that for this one will be a sergeant in there so they can have some say in it. So it's just not one person. We're also going to be using for this first round, we're using multiple personnel like Kurt had put in there for the interview. We're looking at who does our backgrounds. We're going to be looking at who our officers are here, how are they successful. So it's moving forward. We're taking these. They're very important to us. They're good guidelines. And we're going to try and take as many nuggets as we can and move forward. Put something in place and then share that with the new chief when he or she's here.
I guess the question at hand was, so we have 12 goals in front of us here, as well as some other recommendations. Are we working towards meeting these goals in these reports or these recommendations, or are we checked all the boxes or,
Yeah, we're working on a lot of these. Not
Okay.
all the boxes are checked.
sure,
That's a work in progress. But yeah, all the recommendations on the 6 and 7, we're working on that.
some sort of look fors and steps to meet those recommendations.
Absolutely.
Awesome, thank you.
And I would say that Alex and Chief have been in contact with Stuart and myself on almost a weekly basis. So that there's an ongoing dialogue. Alex I'm on her speed dial. Um, And
That's comforting though, because, we're consulting with experts and making sure that we are on the right path. So that's
right.
a
Right.
good thing to hear.
And part of the CIS service model, first of all of this is at no cost to our members. This is all bundled into, if you will, what the city is currently paying for liability coverage. This is part of, what's the right thing to do, and let's all get on the same page. And so it's part of our service model. And we'd a whole lot rather spend 20 minutes going over a what if scenario ahead of time than 2.5 days going over and, oh, is it a problem if
Mhm.
after the fact. So your city administrator and your interim chief have been very active working with CIS.
Kurt, back to my original question. What is a formal characteristic success criterion?
Sure. And that's a really great question. It's doing somewhat of what the chief has done is taking a backward snapshot, if you will, of who's here in the department now that is considered in the community a shining star. And what is it that they do or how they do it or how they've trained or whatever, what makes them what they are. And then layering into that a forward looking, how do we find more of that? And then as part of that is it's like, well, then we have to define that. I'm sure you've probably heard in modern management, if we can verbalize the why, then the what becomes easy. And so why are we looking for these characteristics and what are they? And then it makes the what, i.e. the process of the recruitment and these questions that we're formulating now for the panel interview and things like that, so that we do a selection criteria based on what we believe would create a successful candidate. Remember, the process of hiring and starting and training an entry-level law enforcement officer is arduous. It is easily a 4-month process.
Yeah.
From start to finish. The comprehensive background itself can take, yes, comprehensive background itself can take weeks and weeks and weeks. And it's I don't know if any of you all were in the military, if any of you had security clearances, but the comprehensive background is actually very, very closely aligned with an FBI security clearance. That's how invasive it is. And once you get hired, and then you have to go through a psychological evaluation, which is done by a psychologist who is a specialty practitioner within public safety, to be deemed properly able to conduct the duties of a law enforcement officer in Oregon. And then you go to DPSST for 16 weeks. And then you go through your FTEP process, which is anywhere from 3 to 4 months.
Yeah, 17 weeks.
17 weeks, and then you have somebody ready to go out on the road on their own.
Hopefully.
If we've done everything properly up front, when we get through FTEP, we've got someone who can be out on the road on their own.
So in any of the evaluation, the hiring or the processes, was there any look at the city code on the police force and how that matches up to the operations of the police department or not?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
So the city ordinances, we have our own city ordinances on police force. I feel like that just gets ignored.
No, I did not look at city ordinances.
Okay, I was just wondering if ours is, I mean, it was passed probably 30 years ago. I was just wondering if there's updated best practices on these ordinances. I know every now and then there's updates on different ordinances that
Sure.
come
And
down.
I'm going to give you an answer you're not going to like, but I'll tell you right up front. When it comes to how cities themselves operate, our parent, one of our parents, which is the League of Oregon Cities, Patty Mulvihill, she's the general counsel there. She's excellent on city ordinances and city operations and the like.
I'll be talking to some people at the League of Oregon Cities Thursday night. Nothing to do with police. Any other questions?
Oh, I just thought both reports were very good and
Yeah.
interesting. Thank you for that.
Counselor?
If we're all done with the questions related to the report and discussion on the report, first, I just want to make sure that we're done and you guys don't have anything further.
I don't have anything further.
I don't either.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate you guys being here.
Sure.
I just have a question. Would you mind just briefly talking about the new law that has come into play with the whole police reform momentum? Is that something that you guys can just briefly touch on really quick? What's been passed? And
Which one?
There were 16 of them that came
Exactly,
out of the
that's,
last legislative session.
okay, so it's not a brief
There
discussion.
were 16 in the last and 4 in the special session in the summer of 2020. If you had a specific question, it might be easier. Otherwise, we could have you here until breakfast.
Yeah, understood. And so maybe for that reason, we just skip over it. But I was just trying to get general education for council on what those things look like, just very briefly.
One of the things I can tell you is that prior to the police reforms, and I don't remember if it was this session, and Stuart would know better than I, because Stuart worked closely with OACP and the legislature on some of these. But one of the things that became mandatory was that all law enforcement officers being hired or being a lateral transfer to a new agency, even as reserves, have to now go through the psychological evaluation. And I personally, I believe that was really, really important and very, very good. So that's one of the other things that came out. Use of force continuum was one of the others. One of the things that I highlighted in here is one of the very well-known psychologists in the state has worked on what's called the 11th dimension. And the criteria of success in a psychological evaluation is based on the California Post 10 elements of success. He's added an 11th, which is cultural competency. And it speaks exactly to what you would think it would. How does this individual, through their background, their skills, their experience, how they were raised, what are their implicit and their explicit biases, and how may they affect their ability to effectively police in a diverse population?
The dimensions you're talking about the dimensions that California Post had, is that what you're talking about? And the 11th?
The 10 dimensions form the basis of the psychological fitness, the psychological exam. And Dr. Stewart, who works closely with Dr. Corey, has developed an 11th dimension that he is working on, which is cultural competency. And as I talk to members, departments, and agencies in the state, I am recommending that they add that to their psychological exam.
Okay, thank you.
So, I can walk you through just real baseline stuff in terms of what the more major legislative bills included, if you'd like me to.
Mr. Mayor, do you believe we have time for that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if we've got
I'll be
5
brief.
minutes,
They're
yeah.
the ones that would affect smaller communities. So as Kurt indicated, one of them, 4301, deals with what I would characterize as an extension of deadly physical force application. And it really compels officers to go beyond the Graham v. Connor standard that exists today. And it adds 3 additional criteria. And it's really been a source of subjective conversation. And realistically, if you're familiar with the incident that occurred in Tigard and the referral of that particular case to the Department of Justice, it was predicated on these 3 issues in terms of the officers are now compelled to provide a warning if and when practical, afford the individual the opportunity to respond if and when practical, and they have to, either document or demonstrate that they exhausted all available resources prior to or alternatives to the deadly physical force application. So that's a really big one because that really kind of changes the rules of engagement. And then shifting the gears a little bit more to the personnel side of things, some of what came out of the legislative session is in limbo because it requires a rulemaking process. So DPSSD kind of has to propose the structure, if you will, and then it has to go through an approval process. So one of those is a database that will include all officers subject to progressive discipline, which includes an economic sanction. And so now the employer will be compelled to share that information with DPSST, and they will maintain a database. Similarly, they created a law that now compels cities to share information, even if there's a separation agreement or something trying to protect the reason for separation. Now you're compelled to share that information in a background process with other law enforcement agencies making inquiry. That's a pretty substantial change as well, because oftentimes what we saw was, bad actors jumping out front, agreeing to separate, provided that you don't say anything bad about me, I don't say anything bad about you, we go our separate ways, whatever. And they're really trying to neutralize that level of agreement. I would say if I'm in a planning process or strategic planning process, I would look towards accreditation because initially the legislature started, they wanted all law enforcement agencies in Oregon to be accredited. Where we were able to back them down to was 35 sworn. So essentially anybody with 35 sworn personnel or greater is required to attain accreditation. For the larger agencies, it's by the July of 2025, I think, and for the ones between 135, I think it's 26. And so what I look for in the next full session is for them to take another sweep and probably until they get all the agencies on board, because really the argument we made, it's a pretty involved process for smaller agencies that don't necessarily have the resources. But I think it's coming. I think they've got their mind's eye on getting all the agencies accredited, just like they'd like to see body worn cameras and some other things. Some of the other stuff that's out there isn't really applicable to communities this size, but there's just a lot of new language. And fortunately for you all, you're a Lexipol client. Lexipol is your policy provider. So they'll do all of the review of legislative language and provide policy language that can be tailored, adopted, denied, whatever, depending on who's reviewing that information.
I could add that there was a lot of updates that were put out in Lexipol. So those have been approved and put out in the new policy.
Can you ask a question? Does compel mean required? It sounds like they're not going to be required to do it. They're just kind of push that direction or making the reports.
No, they're going to have to. You'll be required essentially once the rulemaking process is over. So it'll be an OAR that will describe that process in terms of sharing that information with DPSST.
And one other question, this is probably for Sean. I noticed we're not accredited. Is that something we should be working toward, accreditation?
I think it's very good to be accredited. I know it's just like Stuart said and CIS would approve. I know it's very labor intensive. A lot of agencies dedicate 1 or 2 officers and non-sworn to go over all the policies, all the criteria, and it usually takes over a year to just get accredited. So I would recommend that, although right now it's, Lexipol's out there and they're taking care of a lot of this stuff that's in the accreditation. So I couldn't put a number on it, but just having the Lexipol policy and the policies out there is very, very helpful. But yeah, I mean, it's be something to look at, although it's going to be very labor intensive and probably costly, but it's going to be worth it.
I do understand that. I've been through accreditation in the schools and it's for a year, it's very time consuming.
I can tell you that being a member of Lexipol, which CIS supports and CIS actually helps defray the costs of the first year implementation of Lexipol. This is a policy manual that runs to hundreds and hundreds of pages, everything from soup to nuts. And an agency that has committed themselves to Lexipol and to using the available templates and making them work for their agency. What we have found is after several years of being a Lexipol policy member, that should they decide to go, and this is before it was mandated, should they decide to go for accreditation, it makes the accreditation process that much smoother.
First, let me thank you for the detailed report for CIS's work on this, and thank you all for a thoughtful presentation this evening. Just one kind of a final question for me. In your conclusion, you state that overall impressions of Scapus Police Department are very positive. Could you sum up how you arrived at that statement?
I think that you're attributing that to me. And so the way I came to that conclusion is a conversation I had with the chief and lieutenant at the time. As I indicated earlier on, I posed essentially 237 questions and evaluate their responses on yes, we do it, or no, we don't do it. And if they say yes, and I have them explain to me, what process they employ, because I don't want just the yes, just to be saying yes. I want to make sure, verify that they actually know what they're talking about. And so in my evaluation, the bones of the organization, which is essentially the policy aspect of things, which is what we're really concerned about, they're all in place. I think the struggles occurred beyond that. And so from that perspective, it is positive. And as I also indicated earlier, I've got to find a way to keep that door open for communication on the back end as well, because I knew that there was going to be a fair amount of work and circle back that I was going to need to do. And so I've got to give them, hope that, yeah, we can get to where we need to be. And quite frankly, as I indicated earlier, there weren't significant deficiencies. It was more apathy in terms of everything was there. It's just a matter of, it's like having all the pieces of the puzzle on the table. It's not quite finished, but yet it's not going to take a whole lot of pieces to get it there. That's the reason that I made the statement.
Well, thank you for that explanation. That's actually very helpful to me.
I'm going to ask a question back to write your name.
Bert?
Yeah. On one of the recommendations, it was based on the turnover ratio of the department, new hires. You wanted to quantify a picture of a successful candidate. Is it that just the personal part of the candidate, or is there a bigger picture? Like, when I first got on council 20 some odd years ago, officers were so underpaid, the equipment was so bad that, we actually had to jump their salaries just to be competitive so we could keep officers. And then I had officers that had said to me that when they go to work, that they tell their wife, if something happens to me, it's probably because of the antiquated equipment, and to call their lawyer. And fortunately, we don't have that issue anymore, but pay might still be an issue. How does the officer's salary fit into this model of a successful candidate?
So,
especially in today's competitive nature.
and actually, Alex, you might want to answer that, because Alex has reached out to me, and Alex has been working on getting a better understanding of the pay and benefit structure, as well as Chief Davis. Especially in today's law enforcement environment, if a qualified, sworn, certified officer can stay in the home they're in and move an agency and get what they believe is an adequate pay and benefit package, they're probably going to do it. When I was speaking again more globally, very similar to Stuart. We are the insurance pool. We are consultants. We don't come in and tell you, you got to do this. We come in and say, this is a best practice. These are some things you should look at. These are some things that you should be concerned about or that you should address within your overall organizational culture. And certainly pay and benefits. You know, I mean, we've all been to the same management classes. We've all heard, you know, that pay isn't a primary satisfier. Well, lack of a perception of a fair pay is a primary dissatisfier. And you might say, well, Chapman, you're splitting hairs. But I think, you know, great pay doesn't make up for a horrible culture. Great pay fits into and helps a culture. But the baseline here, and what I was trying to suggest was that the Scapus Police Department needed to define who they were and how they interacted with their community, with their elected officials, with their city administrator, and with each other. And that's before we even talk about neighboring agencies. So is pay part of it? I won't say it isn't part of it, but it's not a huge part of it, but it is part.
Yeah,
that
at some
help in any
level
way?
it becomes a part of it.
I am, you know, I've been out here many, many times. You have pretty good equipment. You have a rotational program for vehicles and for things like that. I mean, when I got to the city of Bend, they had 8-year-old Crown Vics. And if you know how long an automobile runs in a
20 years
police-
ago, we were buying those from them.
No, you weren't, because we were saving them. Because we were saving them so that as the other Crown Vics, you know, as transmissions dropped off, we had four skeletons that we just would rob parts off of. But
Yeah, I know.
your equipment is good. Your training meets standards, and I think it's that kind of that amorphous culture. Who are we? How do we interact with each other? How do we make Scapus a better place for the citizen?
I think that that's where whoever's hired as the new chief is going to have an incredible opportunity, because there's no lieutenant currently in position. There's multiple officers positions. So he or she will get the opportunity to actually hire their lieutenant, which doesn't always happen when a chief comes into position. There's, you know, so they end up working with, you know, in any job, personalities can clash. You never know how that's actually going to work out. But if they get to build their setup, it's like I told Alex when she was hired, one of the things with Jill deciding to retire soon, and she's got this opportunity to really put her stamp on the city. And, you know, with this help, I think it's a great, and I appreciate that you guys do this work. And thank you for coming. Is
Sure.
there any other questions?
No, thank you. Then.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Excellent.
All right, we'll take about a 15-minute break.